Before we start the Sikha, just a general introduction. We have a machlokes between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva of how the mitzvahs were given. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that all the mitzvahs were said along with their details on Har Sinai, later repeated again in the Oyel Moed, that is the Mishkan, and finally a third time when the Yidden were about to go into Eretz Yisrael. On the other hand, Rabbi Yishmael is of the opinion the way the mitzvahs were given was only in a general way in Har Sinai, and the details were given later in the Oyel Moed. Another thing to keep in mind is that the Yidden, after making the Mishkan at the foot of Har Sinai, which is, of course, almost a year after they came out of Mitzrayim, they still remained next to Har Sinai for a while before traveling away late in Chodesh Iyar of the following year, in other words, the year after Yetzias Mitzrayim, a month and a half after building the Mishkan. That's how long they remained still at the foot of Har Sinai. Now going to the Rashi itself in the beginning of the Parsha. The Parsha starts off by saying, the Eibishter speaks to Moshe Rabbeinu at Har Sinai, and tells him the dinim of Shemitah. Rashi asks, Ma'in Shemitah etzel Har Sinai, why is Shemitah being mentioned together with Har Sinai? And Rashi tells us that just like Shemitah, all of the general ideas and the details were given at Har Sinai, so too all the mitzvahs were given at Sinai. Rashi says this comes from the Toras Kohanim, and the Rashi goes on to explain that it seems to me that what the Toras Kohanim means is that since we don't find this being repeated later in Arvei Shmoyav, clearly it was given all over here at Sinai. And from this we learn also regarding the rest of the mitzvahs that they were all given at Sinai. So it seems to be what's bothering Rashi is, like what's bothering the Toras Kohanim, is why is Shemitah mentioned together with Sinai? The question then, however, is why doesn't Rashi in his Dibur HaMaschil quote anything about Shemitah? He only quotes the words Behar Sinai. He doesn't even say V'goymer. With Rashi's answer that everything was given in Sinai, it seems to be that Rashi is trying to negate the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, which tells us that the details were actually specified in the Mishkan and the Oyel Moed, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva that says everything was given at Har Sinai. It seems to be that Rashi is learning like Rabbi Akiva. But if that's the case, why does Rashi say because they weren't repeated in Arvei Shmoyav? Seemingly, well, if it's not repeated in Arvei Shmoyav, it could still be that it was said in the Oyel Moed. It's still not a proof that we're going along with Rabbi Akiva that everything was said in Har Sinai. It still could be, according to Rabbi Yishmael, that it was said, the details, in the Oyel Moed. Rashi says, as we quoted before, that everything was repeated in Arvei Shmoyav. And again, the issue is only whether it was said in Sinai or the Oyel Moed. So Rashi should have said everything was repeated in the Oyel Moed, not say everything was repeated in Arvei Shmoyav. The whole argument over here between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel was mainly about the Oyel Moed. Is this a repeat or is this new details being given? The Rebbe also asks, why does Rashi have to start explaining venerally that this is the meaning of the Toras Kohanim? How else could we explain the Toras Kohanim? And finally, one other question that we're going to be looking at is why does Rashi, along in his Rashi, keep on saying the word Sinai rather than Har Sinai as it says in the Pasuk? So the Rebbe says that what was actually bothering Rashi was something else completely. Rashi is bothered by the words Behar Sinai, regardless of the mitzvah of Shemitah. That is, way back in Parshas Sisa, Rashi told us already that from when the Mishkan was set up, the Eibishter only spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu from the Oyel Moed and not from Har Sinai. So why suddenly over here does it say Behar Sinai, many Parshias later? The end of the whole Vayikra, which was all said in the Oyel Moed. It's very difficult to say that it's only because of ein mukdam and u'char b'Torah, things are not necessarily in the chronological order. We only say that if we have no other choice. And therefore, what Rashi is really trying to tell us over here, that when it says Behar Sinai, doesn't mean on the mountain of Sinai. Har Sinai in the broader sense means the whole area of Har Sinai, including the Oyel Moed that was standing at the foot of the mountain. And therefore, Rashi is not even dealing with Rabbi Yishmael or Rabbi Akiva, whether it was said in a general way on Har Sinai and then the details in Oyel Moed, or whether the details were also said in Har Sinai. It could go either way. All we're saying by Har Sinai means it was said in this general area. Now, seemingly, to say such a thing that Har Sinai means in the area of Har Sinai would be a big chidush. Where is Rashi getting this from? And this is why Rashi is bringing the Toras Kohanim with a back and forth about why does Shemitah say next to Har Sinai. In other words, it's from the way that the Toras Kohanim learns this limud of all the mitzvahs that the details were given at Sinai, that's how we know what the Torah's Kohanim actually means. That Sinai means not Har Sinai, but the area of Sinai. How is that? What do we actually learn from the fact that Shemitah was said in Har Sinai? Since by Shemitah itself we would have known that all the details were said at Sinai because they are not repeated in Arvei Smoyov, from this we're going to learn that for the rest of the mitzvahs the same thing applies. Because we don't need to be told this about Shemitah itself, because since it's not repeated in Arvei Smoyov, so obviously all the details are being given over here. So, since we don't need it for Shemitah, because it's clearly in the pasuk that it says all the details over here, not in Arvei Smoyov, we're going to say this is going to teach us about the rest of the mitzvahs. But this only applies if we translate Sinai, the area of Sinai, the general region of Sinai, then we would know, the Torah is telling us that all the details are being said over here and not in Arvei Smoyov. If we should translate that Sinai means Har Sinai, then could be what the Torah is coming to tell us is relevant for Shemitah itself. Because we need to negate the idea that it wasn't said in the Oyel Moed, it was said on Har Sinai. Again, if Har Sinai over here means Har Sinai Shemitah literally being said on the mountain, then we need it for Shemitah itself. Because otherwise I would have thought it was just given in the Oyel Moed like everything else. So the Torah needs to tell us Har Sinai. If it's then being learned for Shemitah itself, how does that teach us anything about any other mitzvahs? It's needed for Shemitah. But since the way Rashi is understanding the Torah's Kohanim is that, no, Shemitah is being said in the region of Sinai. But if it's being said in the region of Sinai, why do you even have to tell it to me? I know it wasn't said in Arvei Smoyov because it doesn't say by Arvei Smoyov. So from here I'm learning something else, that also all the other mitzvahs were originally said at Sinai, the region of Sinai, not necessarily on Har Sinai, but in the region of Sinai, and later when they're being said in Arvei Smoyov, it is just a repetition. And this is why Rashi is saying that Sinai means over here the area of Sinai. This is also why Rashi keeps on repeating the word Sinai rather than Har Sinai. Now the truth of the matter is, in Pshutei Shel Mikra, it seems that Rashi is actually specifically going more with the Shita of Rabbi Yishmael rather than Rabbi Akiva. In other words, it seems to be that what Rashi is actually saying is that all the mitzvahs are given at Sinai, meaning not at Har Sinai, but as we explained, in the region of Sinai, which would include the Oyel Moed, like Rabbi Yishmael said, as opposed to Rabbi Akiva, which claimed that even the details were given at Har Sinai, because that would fit more with the Pshutei Shel Mikra, that we take things at face value as the way it seems in the Torah, that they are being said wherever the Torah says that they're being said, and if there's no details being given earlier, it makes sense that the details weren't given earlier and were being given later wherever the Torah puts them. So in Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rabbi Yishmael's way of looking at it actually seems to fit better. But the halacha is actually like Rabbi Akiva. So the Rebbe is going to explain how these two shittas, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, and why they're both true in a certain level, one more in Pshutei Shel Mikra and one more al derech halacha. And the Rebbe explains as follows. Rabbi Yishmael, as we know, is a Kohen Gadol, and his avodah represents the avodah of tzaddikim. Rabbi Akiva, on the other hand, we know is a ben geirim, and his avodah represents more the idea of a Baal Tshuva. And his avodah was, as we know, he said, Kol Yomai, my whole life I was looking forward to be able to fulfill the idea of Mesiras Nefesh, like the idea of a Baal Tshuva that's going beyond all limitations. Now, Oyel Moed versus Sinai is also a similar sort of idea. Oyel Moed represents an organized, regular avodah, like in the Mishkan, we have different levels of Kedusha, and so on and so forth. Midbar Sinai, the area of Midbar Sinai represents a place that's not settled, it's going beyond limitations, not Tam Vadas. It's an area that we say, what happened at Sinai? On every single one of the Dibris, Parcha Nishmas and the Neshamis are flying out. It's an avodah that's higher than Tam Vadas. And therefore, we now have the two shittas. Rabbi Yishmael, who's the avodah of tzaddikim, is of the opinion that only the general idea was given at Sinai, meaning when we come to avodah, it's only in the general area of the avodah, in the beginning of the avodah, in the foundation of the avodah. At the beginning, we need to have Mesiras Nefesh. We need to have the general idea of Mesiras Nefesh at the beginning of avodah. So Klal Yisrael were Misinai, but the details of a mitzvah, once we get involved in the mitzvah, that's Oyel Moed that needs to be done in a very organized, specific way. Comes Rabbi Akiva, the avodah of Baal Tshuva, and he says, no, everything is Sinai. Everything comes from Sinai. The idea of Mesiras Nefesh needs to permeate both the klal and the prat, both the general idea of the mitzvahs, down to the little tiniest details. All has to be done in this special Mesiras Nefesh type of way.